My docking clamps locked onto Hyperion 4's dead port with a clang that echoed through nothing, and every clock on my instrument panel, all 6 of them, synchronized to Vanguard Orbital's atomic standard, fell back exactly 7 seconds at once. I checked my wrist. The mechanical one, the backup I wore for situations where electronics couldn't be trusted. 15-year-old Swiss movement. Wound every morning, never touched by a power cell or a synchronization signal. It had also lost 7 seconds. I stared at the face of it for a moment, watching the second hand complete one full revolution, counting the quiet clicks. Then I unbuckled my harness and moved toward the airlock. The seal pressurized clean. Atmospheric composition nominal. Nitrogen-oxygen mix within habitable parameters. Trace CO2 at acceptable levels. Humidity at 31%. Temperature inside the station, -11°C, which was cold but not lethal. I pulled my helmet on anyway and cycled through. The corridor beyond was pale blue. Emergency panels only, set into ceiling channels at 4-meter intervals, casting that thin, flat light that makes everything look like it exists at the bottom of a very still lake. Every surface was covered in frost. The handrails had it. The cable conduits had it. The corporate logo stenciled on the wall had it. Letters sharp and cold. Crystals growing from the paint like the station had been trying to write its own epitaph in ice. Hyperion 4. Vanguard Orbital Research Division. Sector 7 Kappa. And below that, in smaller letters, someone had added with a permanent marker, home. I moved forward. My boots made no sound on the grating. The frost had gotten into the perforations and sealed them solid, turning the floor into a continuous surface. The silence was the kind that presses against you, not the silence of an empty room, which still has air movement and the faint mechanical sounds of a building settling and ventilating and existing. This was the silence of a place that had stopped. The absence of all the sounds that a functioning station produced constantly and invisibly, the background texture of life. And into that absence, the frost crystals sparkled under my helmet light, and the pale blue panels cast their flat, watercolor shadows, and there was nothing else. The station had been dark for 20 years. The last confirmed transmission from Hyperion 4 was a routine status report, filed at 14:32 Standard Time on a Thursday in what now felt like a distant geological era, followed by nothing. No distress call, no system failure log, which would have been automatic, no final entry in the station log, which the crew were required by contract to update every 48 hours. Just a transmission, clean and unremarkable, and then silence, and then more silence, and eventually the company had written off the crew, the equipment, and the research, in that order, with the research appearing twice in the insurance filing, because there were 2 categories it fell under. The navigational beacon had activated 11 hours ago. I had been in the middle of a maintenance cycle on my shuttle's secondary drive when the alert came through, and I had read it 3 times before I understood it. Beacon signal confirmed, Sector 7 Kappa, source, Hyperion 4. I had then called the duty officer at Vanguard, who had also read it several times, and then called her supervisor, and then called me back to tell me I was to proceed immediately, recover the research data on the experimental thrust generators, and document the status of the crew. The status of the crew. As if there were more than one possible status after 20 years of silence. At the first junction I stopped and checked my chronometer. 9 hours 14 minutes and 32 seconds. I had logged dock entry at 9 hours 12 minutes and 8 seconds. I was on schedule. The act of confirming it settled something in my chest that I hadn't noticed was unsettled. A small internal release, the way a held breath goes when you find what you were looking for. I had been doing this for 11 years, the constant checking and logging and confirming, and I had learned not to fight it. The anxiety was a tool. Managed correctly, it kept me precise. The control room for the docking module was 3 meters to my left. I stepped inside and swept my helmet light across the console. There was a mug on the panel. White ceramic, the Vanguard logo printed on the side in the company's particular shade of orange. The specific orange that someone in corporate had decided represented reliability and forward momentum, and that I had always thought looked like a traffic cone. Standard issue crew mug, the kind that lived in every galley and break room of every Vanguard installation I had ever visited. I had one exactly like it in my shuttle, currently sitting in the cup holder to the left of my pilot's seat. A thin thread of steam rose from it, barely visible in the cold air. I watched it curl once, a slow question mark, and dissolve. I reached out and held my gloved hand 2 centimeters above the rim. Through the insulation layer of the glove, I could feel it. Warmth. Definite, unmistakable warmth. The kind that meant the liquid inside was still well above room temperature. The kind that said someone had poured this within the last few minutes. On the near side of the mug, at the 9 o'clock position of the rim, there was a print. Pale pink. Lipstick. The contact point where someone's lower lip had rested. Clear enough that the individual texture of the application was visible. Fresh enough that the edges hadn't dried to a crust, hadn't separated from the ceramic in the small pulling away that happened as cosmetics dried. I pulled my hand back and looked at the mug for another 4 seconds. The steam continued to rise. The frost crystals on the panel inches away from the mug's base caught the light and sparkled. I wrote the time in my log, 9 hours 15 minutes and 1 second, and continued deeper into the station. The central module was 2 minutes of corridor away by my pre-mission map. I kept my pace steady, checking each intersection before I crossed it, sweeping my helmet light into the shadows before I passed through them. There was nothing in the shadows. There was nothing anywhere. The station was as empty as any abandoned structure I had entered in 11 years of extraction work, which was to say it was emptier than it should have been, because at minimum I had expected to find something biological, the kind of slow transformation that time and vacuum and cold worked on organic matter. Decomposition, or what you got in the absence of decomposition. There was none of it. There was something under the silence. A low, continuous sound in the station's internal comm system, coming through the speakers set into the corridor ceiling at 10-meter intervals. I had noticed it faintly at the airlock and dismissed it as interference. Standing beneath the second speaker in the corridor, I stopped and listened properly. White noise, mostly. The broadband hiss of induction from the magnetic field of the gas giant below, which was strong enough in this sector to affect unshielded wiring. The pre-mission briefing had mentioned it. I had read the relevant paragraph twice and marked it in my notes. The sound was a known phenomenon, a physical explanation, a documented effect. But white noise had a shape, and this sound had a shape. A slow rise in the bass frequency, building over 4 or 5 seconds to a peak that was not quite a peak because it flattened and held, and then a fall over 4 or 5 more seconds back to the floor, and then a pause, a genuine pause of 2 or 3 seconds, and then the rise again. Rise, pause, fall, rise, pause, fall. The magnetic induction of a gas giant did not pause. I pushed through the hatch into the central module and stopped. 5 people sat at their workstations. They were all in thermal layers, the station issue kind with the Vanguard logo on the left breast, and they were all actively engaged with their screens or their instruments, and they all turned to look at me at exactly the same moment, the way people do when a door opens unexpectedly, that simultaneous reflex that doesn't quite look natural because it's too synchronized. Pilot, the nearest one said. She was a woman in her mid-30s, dark hair pulled back in a tight braid, a coffee mug identical to the one in the docking control room held in her left hand. Her expression was the precise mixture of surprise and mild irritation I had seen on researchers' faces before when logistics interrupted something they were in the middle of. Her name tag read Chun. We weren't expecting resupply for another 2 weeks. I'm not resupply, I said. Then what are you? This from the man at the far console. He had turned fully in his chair, one arm resting on the back of it, relaxed. His name tag read Okafor. He had the look of someone who had been awake for a long time and had adjusted to it, the particular clearness around the eyes that came from sustained concentration rather than rest. Captain Arthur Vale, Vanguard Orbital Emergency Extraction. Your beacon activated. Chen looked at the others. A rapid sweep of eye contact, left and right, taking in the room. Whatever passed between them in that moment was quick and wordless and conclusive. We didn't activate the beacon, she said. It activated 11 hours ago. Vanguard received the signal. That's not possible, Okafor said. The beacon is on a dormancy lock. Manual override only. None of us have been near the communications relay in the past week. A week, I said. Since Tuesday, Chen said. When we ran the thrust generator test. I looked at all 5 of them in turn. Chen, Okafor, the woman at the thermal systems console, Park on her tag. The young man with a calibration instrument at the secondary bench, Mirelis. The older man at the far left station who had not turned around at all, typing with slow, methodical keystrokes. All of them present, alert, functioning. Hair clean. Clothing showing the normal compression and creasing of a week of wear. No malnutrition, no pallor, no degraded muscle tone. If I had walked into a station isolated for a week following a communications failure, this was exactly what I would have expected. Can I access your station chronometer? I asked. Shin gestured toward the main console without suspicion. I walked to it, passed in front of Okafor's station. He watched me with polite neutrality and reached the primary display panel. I found the time display and pulled it to the main screen. The station clock read a date that was 20 years and 4 months and 17 days behind the current standard date. I stood with my hands on the console edge and looked at the numbers. I did not allow my expression to change. I had been in enough situations that required maintaining a functional exterior while the interior processed something it was not ready for, and this was one of those situations, and the practice was there when I needed it. Something wrong? Chen asked. She was still holding her mug. She had not taken a sip while I was watching. Navigation discrepancy in my pre-approach data, I said. My onboard charts for this sector are flagging some inconsistencies. It happens when you're working near significant gravitational sources. I'm going to need to run a few equipment checks. Standard protocol for an unscheduled extraction approach. She nodded, already half turning back toward her screen. Let us know if you need anything. I walked to the far side of the module, where the equipment lockers were bolted to the hull, and I began my checks. My hands moved through the motions automatically. Open locker. Inventory equipment. Note condition. Log findings. The motions were familiar enough that I could perform them without occupying the part of my mind that was working on the station clock, the mug of coffee, the 7-second discrepancy in my instruments at docking. The equipment in the lockers was perfect. Every seal intact, every sensor calibrated, every item in its designated place and in its documented condition. The preservation was complete, the kind you achieved in a controlled environment with regular maintenance. There was no dust on anything, not even the fine accumulation that happened in any enclosed space over time, the slow rain of particulate matter from air circulation and human presence. 20 years of entropy had left no trace anywhere I looked. The material of the station itself showed nothing. The alloy paneling was clean. The rubber gasket seals on the locker doors were soft and pliable. The polymer cable insulation in the bundle that ran along the lower wall had not cracked or yellowed. The display screens, which should have shown significant UV discoloration after 2 decades under the emergency panels, were clear. I unzipped my outer gear layer to access the diagnostic port on my suit's monitoring system. The zipper pull crumbled. The small plastic tag, Vanguard branded, the same orange logo, molded from high-density polymer rated for extreme temperature cycling, had been there when I suited up 4 hours ago. It disintegrated in my fingers, shedding a fine powder of degraded material onto my glove. I looked at my palm. A light dusting of grayish-white particles, the physical residue of plastic that had exceeded its service life. I looked at the glove itself. The outer surface had a chalky quality I had not noticed in my pre-boarding checks. Subtle, but visible now that I was looking for it, a loss of surface sheen, a slight powdering of the topmost layer. I flexed my fingers. The material gave in a way it should not have given. The very slight stiffness of polymer that had begun the slow process of losing its plasticizers, of returning to the brittleness that all polymers were drifting toward if you gave them enough time. I had given it 4 hours. The station had given it 20 years. I moved back to the locker and looked at the hull plating behind it, where my shoulder had brushed the wall when I opened the door. A streak of rust, thin and faintly orange, ran along the contact point. My suit's shoulder plate had made it. The suit itself was oxidizing. In a controlled atmosphere, in a space designed specifically to prevent corrosion, my gear was rusting against the clean metal of the station's wall. I closed the locker and walked back toward the central work area, keeping my movements at the same unhurried pace I had been using since I came aboard. Dr. Chun. She looked up. I need to run a quick biological baseline on all 5 crew members. Standard procedure for extended isolation. Won't take long. We've only been isolated a week, she said. I know, but protocol requires it after any communications blackout that triggers a beacon response. Liability documentation. She accepted this with the resignation of someone who had been dealing with corporate liability documentation for their entire career. She held out her wrist. I ran the biosensor over each of them in turn. Cell division rates, telomere markers, metabolic byproduct accumulation. 40-second cycle per person, a faint chirp at the end of each. I moved from Chun to Park to Mireles to Okafor, and finally to the man at the far station, who turned when I approached. His name tag said Reyes. His expression was the most neutral of the 5. He held out his wrist without speaking and looked at the wall while the scanner ran. I logged all 5 sets of readings and stepped to the equipment locker near the main entrance, which was empty and far enough from the work area to give me effective privacy with my back turned. I read the analysis. Cell division rates consistent with 7 days of normal biological time. Telomere markers consistent with 7 days, which was to say they showed almost no change from baseline. Telomere degradation happened too slowly to be measurable on a weekly scale. Metabolic byproduct accumulation consistent with 7 days of normal metabolism at the activity levels I had observed. All 5 of them had experienced exactly 7 days since Hyperion 4's last transmission. The discrepancy between that fact and the date on the station clock was 20 years, for months, and 17 days. I put the scanner away. I stood facing the equipment locker for a moment, looking at my own faint reflection in the polished metal of the door, the distorted ghost of a face in a helmet, behind which a mind was working through something. I gave myself 10 seconds, counting them. Then I turned around. The beam from my helmet light caught the floor at an oblique angle as I moved, sweeping across the grating at the low horizontal that happened when I turned my head to check the secondary console. The light source was above and behind me, which meant the shadows of the people in the room fell forward and to the left, toward the far wall. Okafor had turned back to his console and was reaching for an instrument on the upper shelf, a calibrated probe of some kind, the kind used in particulate analysis. His arm moved at normal speed. His shadow, cast by the emergency panel directly above his station, moved a fraction of a second later. I stopped walking. Not a natural lag. Not the kind you got from 2 light sources at different angles, which created an offset that varied with position and was geometrically predictable. This was clean and regular. The body moved. The shadow moved after, with a delay that was constant regardless of the direction or speed of the movement. Like a projection running behind its source. Like 2 systems operating on slightly different temporal clocks, one of which was running just barely slower than the other. I watched for 30 seconds, standing still in the middle of the module, and none of the 5 crew members noticed that I had stopped. They were occupied with their work. The white noise in the speakers continued its patient rise and fall. Mireles said something to Park about a calibration figure that was coming in low, and Park said to recheck the sensor mounting, and their shadows moved after them, exactly half a heartbeat behind, every time. I looked at my own shadow. Mine moved with me. Simultaneous, immediate, the normal physics of light and obstruction. I filed this information in the part of my mind designated for things that needed to be understood later, and I walked to the station's main data terminal. This was the primary reason I had come. The research data on the experimental thrust generators, which had been classified at the second highest level the company maintained, which represented 10 years of development and more money than I would earn in the rest of my career. The duty officer had been very clear about the data. She had been somewhat less clear about the crew, had used the phrase document the status without specifying what documentation was expected for a situation she had clearly not been briefed to anticipate. I plugged in the download module and initiated the transfer. The terminal accepted the module without challenge. I had the access codes, supplied by Vanguard before departure, which meant either the security team had not considered that 20-year-old codes might still be valid, or they had considered it and determined it was not a meaningful risk, given the alternative. "What are you pulling?" Chen asked. "Research logs and the full incident record. Standard documentation. There hasn't been an incident." "The beacon activated," I said. "Anything that triggers a beacon triggers a documentation requirement. It's in the operational framework." She turned back to her screen, satisfied or uninterested or both. The download progress bar moved steadily across the terminal display. I watched it and thought about the shadow delay and thought about the mug of coffee and thought about my zipper pull turning to powder and thought about the station clock showing a date that was 20 years in the past and the crew showing a week's worth of biological time and the station showing nowhere whatsoever while my suit rusted against its walls. The download finished. I ejected the module and secured it. "I'm going to complete a hull integrity pass," I said. "Routine final step before I file the approach documentation. I'll come back through the main lock." "Understood," Chen said, without looking up. "We'll be here." I walked back through the corridor. Steady pace, same as before. My helmet light moved across the frost crystals, and they sparkled. The white noise breathed in the speakers. Rise. Pause. Fall. At the junction, I stopped and looked at the docking control room. The mug was still steaming. I looked at my log. 47 minutes had passed since I first observed the mug. In 47 minutes, in a room at -11 Celsius, a mug of hot coffee left open to the air would not merely have cooled. It would have been approaching the ambient temperature, the steam long since gone, the surface of the liquid still. The thermal physics of the situation allowed for no other outcome. The steam continued to rise. The same thread, the same unhurried curl, the same dissolution into the cold air. Exactly as it had been at 9 hours 15 minutes and 1 second. As it had been, I understood with a clarity that arrived quietly and without drama, as it had been for 20 years. As it would be. The heat had nowhere to go because there was no future for it to dissipate into. I walked to the airlock. I cycled the inner door with the same practiced motions I had used on arrival. The chamber pressurized to tunnel conditions. I reached for the outer door release. It released normally. The docking tunnel extended ahead of me, the 2-meter corrugated tube connecting the station to the point where my shuttle should have been. My shuttle was not there. I stood at the inner end of the tunnel and looked at the outer end, and beyond the outer end, at what remained. It was distributed across the outer hull of the station in a rough oval around the docking port. Hull plating, or what had been hull plating, now folded and collapsed and corroded through in multiple places, the metal eaten to lace, and then to crumble. The viewport had imploded, the polymer gone entirely, the frame that had held it reduced to a crumbling outline. The engine housings were unrecognizable. The interior, visible through the largest gap in what remained of the hull, had been subjected to 20 years of entropy at the same rate I had observed working on my suit. 20 years compressed into whatever time had passed since I docked, which was 47 minutes by my log, but was apparently 20 years by the physics operating outside the station's hull. I stood there and ran through the options. I tried the communicator, static on all frequencies, emergency channels included. The long-range array was degraded, as the crew had said. My suit's emergency transmitter was still functional, for now. The nearest Vanguard asset was 6 light hours away. A rescue response was 12 hours out at minimum. My suit had launched with 22 hours of life support and had been running for just under 1 hour, but the seals were compromised and the degradation was not something the gauge measured. The math did not work in any configuration I tried. What was going to happen was not an option I was choosing. It was simply what the situation was. I stood in the tunnel for 9 minutes and 20 seconds by my log. I counted my heartbeats against the second hand of my mechanical watch. Then I walked back through the airlock. The central module was exactly as I had left it. 5 scientists at their stations. The pale blue light from the emergency panels. The frost on every external surface, intact, undisturbed. The white noise in the speakers, breathing in its patient cycle. Mireles and Park were still discussing the calibration reading. Chun was typing something. 2 fingers, the way people typed when they were thinking through what they were writing rather than transcribing. Okafor was making notes in a physical notebook, the old habit of researchers who didn't trust digital systems with primary observations. Chun looked up when I came back through the hatch. All done. I looked past her. The station had a configuration I had memorized from the pre-mission schematics. It was a wheel-and-spoke design. The central module at the hub, 6 radial corridors leading to the outer ring where the specialized labs and crew quarters were located. The communications relay was in the outer ring, in the sector directly opposite the docking port. The experimental thrust generator was in a sealed laboratory module attached to the outer ring, accessible only from the spoke corridor marked with red safety striping. The chair beside Reyes's station was empty. Communications officer position, in the original crew manifest from the station's commissioning 20 years ago. 7 people had boarded Hyperion 4. The manifest was in the pre-mission briefing. 7, of whom 5 were still here, in this room, at their stations. The other 2 were unaccounted for. I thought about what it meant to be unaccounted for in a location where time had stopped. Equipment check complete, I said. One thing I need to verify before I file my report. Of course. Chin's tone was professional, helpful, utterly without suspicion. The beacon. I need to confirm the activation mechanism. The duty officer flagged it for the incident report. Chin frowned slightly. We told you, we didn't activate it. I understand. I need to verify the technical record. 5 minutes in the communications relay room. Okafor looked up from his notebook. I can take you there. I can find it from the schematics, I said. No need to interrupt your work. The spoke corridor with the communications relay was colder than the central module. The emergency lighting was dimmer, 2 panels out entirely, creating stretches of near darkness between the pools of pale blue. My helmet light filled these adequately. I moved at a normal pace, listening. The white noise was fainter here, attenuated by distance from the main speaker system. I could hear my own breathing, the slight hiss of my suit's circulation system, the frost-muffled sound of my boots on the grating. The communications relay room was a modest space, 4 meters by 4 meters, dominated by the relay console and the antenna control array. The beacon activation panel was on the left wall, clearly labeled with the yellow and black striping that indicated systems requiring manual override. The panel's status display was showing active, signal broadcasting. I studied the activation mechanism. Physical switch, not electronic. Required a key, a code, and a physical action in sequence. The same design philosophy as emergency releases on aircraft, requiring deliberate intent and multiple simultaneous inputs to prevent accidental activation. The key was in the lock. The code panel showed the entered sequence. The physical switch was in the active position. Someone had activated this beacon deliberately and recently, using a key that should have been secured in the captain's emergency kit, entering a code that was changed quarterly and would have been rotated 17 times in the past 5 years of the theoretical maintenance schedule that no one had been maintaining because no one had been there. Except the code on the panel was one of the original commissioning codes, the first one ever assigned to this station. The one that would never have been changed because there was no one here to change it. and had been valid for the entire 20 years because the station's security system had never been updated, because the station's security system was frozen at the same moment as everything else. I stood in the communications relay room and looked at the active beacon panel and thought about what it meant that someone had chosen to activate it. The crew in the central module maintained they had not touched it. The crew in the central module had shadows that moved half a heartbeat after they did. But something had activated it. Something with access to the key, knowledge of the original code, and enough physical presence to turn a physical switch. Or something that needed what a beacon attracted. Something that had been waiting, with patience that only something outside of time could afford, for the right moment to send a signal that would bring a living person through the dock. I logged the relay room findings and walked back toward the central module. I was not going to reach Vanguard. I had understood this in the docking tunnel, and I continued to understand it now, with the clarity that came from having run the numbers twice and found them unchanged both times. The suit would fail before rescue arrived, assuming rescue was dispatched immediately on receipt of my emergency transmission, assuming the transmission was received, assuming the degradation of my suit's systems did not take the emergency transmitter first. What I was going to do instead had become apparent to me in the same quiet, undramatic way that most inevitable things became apparent. Not as a decision I made, but as a description of what the situation was. The cold in the corridor was different on my return walk. Not colder by temperature. The suit's sensors showed the same -11, but differently felt. The way the same air changes when you are moving towards something rather than away from it. I noticed the frost crystals more carefully. The way they grew in fractal patterns on the cable conduits, branching and branching again. 20 years ago, someone had breathed in this corridor, and the moisture of that breath was still here, locked in ice. Every molecule in its original position. Chen looked up when I came back through the hatch for the second time. Verified. Verified. The chair beside Reyes's station had been the communications officer's position. His name had been Santos. The mission manifest listed him as 41 years old at the time of departure, which meant he would have been 61 now, if time had been moving for him, which it had not. The chair was empty. I crossed the module toward it without explaining myself and sat down. Reyes did not look up when I sat beside him. He was working through a long column of figures on his screen, checking them against a printed sheet that was clipped to a board on his left. His handwriting was small and precise. The movement of his hand across the page was steady and regular. His shadow, cast by the panel above his station, moved half a heartbeat after him. I looked at my wrist. The mechanical watch, wound this morning, keeping its own time. The second hand was moving. I watched it sweep around the dial, counting out the moments in small, precise clicks, the way it had been doing since I put it on, the way it had been doing for 15 years. It was the most reliable object I owned, and it was telling me that time was still passing, that the seconds were still being produced and consumed in the normal way, that I was still inside the current flowing forward through the universe. Then it began to move faster. The acceleration was slow at first, barely noticeable. I might have imagined it, might have written it off as a trick of attention. But the clicks were coming closer together, the gaps between them compressing, and the second hand was moving with the slightly blurred quality of something approaching the limit of what the eye could track. The minute hand moved. I watched it, which you did not normally watch, because it moved too slowly to observe in real time, but now it was not moving too slowly. It made one full revolution while I was watching it. The hour hand moved. The face of the watch became a single smear of motion, chrome and black, and the fine scratches I had put on the crystal over 15 years. The clicking ran together into a continuous tone, a high, thin sound that I could feel more than hear. Then it stopped. The second hand was pointing straight up. 12 o'clock exactly. I put the watch down on the console in front of me and looked at it for a moment. It was still, the way things were still here. The way the mug of coffee was still, in its perpetual moment of just poured. A mug of coffee, identical to the one in the docking control room. White ceramic, Vanguard logo in orange, steam rising in a thin curl, and on the rim at the 9 o'clock position, a half-moon of pale pink that I had not placed there and had not been there before I sat down. I looked at it for a long time. In the speakers, the white noise breathed in its patient cycle. Rise, pause, fall. Around me, 5 scientists worked at their stations, and their shadows moved half a heartbeat after they did, and the frost crystals on the walls caught the light and sparkled. I picked the mug up. It was warm in my hands. Exactly the right temperature. Not too hot to hold, not cool enough to be disappointing. The kind of warmth that meant the coffee had been poured very recently and was waiting to be finished and had all the time in the universe to wait. There was something in the viewport above Reyes's station. Not inside the module. Outside, beyond the scratched polymer of the port. In the absolute dark between the station's hull and the frozen rings of the gas giant. Where there was nothing. Where the darkness was complete and physical, the absence of light that existed at the boundary between the gas giant's atmosphere and the void. Something was in that darkness. I could not have described it in any way that would have meant anything. It was not a shape. It was not a light. It was a quality of the darkness itself. The darkness that was there, where before the darkness had simply been an absence, was now a presence that occupied the same space, and the difference between those two things was legible to some sense that did not have a name and was not included in my suit sensor array. I did not look directly at it. I looked at the coffee. I brought the mug to my lips. The steam touched my face, warm and faintly bitter, the smell of it exactly right. The smell of every mug of coffee I had ever lifted toward my mouth in every break room and cockpit and debrief room in 11 years of work. The rim was warm against my lower lip. At the 9 o'clock position, beneath my fingers, I could feel the faint texture of the lipstick print, someone else's record, left in the ceramic, permanent now in the way that everything here was permanent. Behind me, the white noise breathed. In the viewport, the darkness watched. My hands were still.